Hello everybody, thank you for joining this joint webinar between ClearBox and Wisdom. I'm Sam Marshall, I'm the owner of ClearBox Consulting, and with me is Fleming. Hello Fleming.
Hi, I'm Fleming Goldback. I'm VP of Product at Wisdom. We're a product company that delivers a digital workplace and intranet product on top of Office 365 and SharePoint, and we've been a product company for around 8 years' time. So hello everyone.
Fleming, you jumped straight in there with the intro. Hi, good to have you join us. Let me just, I was going to say a little bit more about ClearBox, but let me do that.
Sorry for interrupting you, Sam.
No, you're keen, I like that. So ClearBox, we're based in the UK. We are an independent consultancy in that we don't sell any products, but we help organizations think through digital workplace strategy. If you want to revamp your intranet and you're not quite sure where it fits or what its purpose should be, or how to introduce it and govern it and get good adoption, then we're the people to come to first. We can help you put your strategy in place, and then we can also help you select things like intranet products, of which Wisdom is one. You might know us because we do an annual report on SharePoint Intranet in a Box add-ons, and we've got a special offer on that, which we'll reveal at the end of the webinar. Wisdom, as you know, joining us here with Fleming. We thought we'd start just with a quick poll. And the poll question will pop up in a moment. It's, what is your biggest challenge in making your Office 365 intranet truly global, or in scaling it up? So it's the biggest challenge to just pick one out of these 5 options, and we'll give you a minute just to put a response in. So I can see the responses rolling in. 71% voted so far, so we'll give you a few more seconds. Imagine the egg timer in your head counting down, the last few grains of sand coming through. Okay, yeah, I think we're about there. Do you want to reveal the answers, Wedge? Okay, so we've got 25% governance, but the winner by quite some margin is employee readiness. What are your thoughts on that, Fleming?
I think it's interesting, but I think it's something that we see as well. It's a fairly difficult, particularly when you scale out across the organization. You have a variety of different personas that you need to sort of find out how do you match their requirements, and so it's not a big surprise, but it's interesting to see that large of a market compared to the other ones.
It really is, and cost only 5%. I mean, I guess Office 365 now, it's with it being cloud-based, it makes that scaling up from a technical point of view much easier than it used to be. But yeah, deepening adoption and maybe reaching some frontline employees is something that we're going to explore as challenges that we often see at ClearBox as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the agenda, if I can find my mouse and pop it up again. On the agenda, we're going to talk about scaling up across 4 different dimensions. So first of all, reach. So moving into different geographies, maybe different countries, for example, and also the number of languages in which your internet's supported. Then we're going to talk about depth. So this is about maybe introducing your intranet to different workers, such as frontline workers that we mentioned, or indeed getting people doing more with the set of tools that you have within Office 365. Then we'll talk about expanding in terms of features, so adding extra functionality to your intranet. And then lastly, we'll talk about the Office 365 side of things and some of the technical considerations. First off, we've got reach. So in particular, what we find with companies that might grow through things like acquisition or mergers is that they go from doing things in a single country, single market mindset to doing things in multiple places. And it's not just about adding extra people into the site, then it's actually about thinking about your intranet in a different way. And with that often comes challenges of how you govern this in a more diverse approach, and how you deal with more than one language if you extend into other geographies. So on the other geographies front, I've got a surface, and it does nothing for my sketching at all because they still look dreadful, but hopefully this communicates what I'm trying to say, which is that normally you would start with an intranet on a kind of centralized model. Let me just see if I can get a laser pointer going. So in a centralized model, let's say you've probably just got one intranet, everybody goes to the same homepage, and then they might go down to different sites for departments. And you've probably got a range of content contributors, these people up here, passing things through to an intranet owner or an intranet publisher who then puts them in the right place on the intranet. As you scale, this model starts to break down because this person in the middle of the funnel gets overwhelmed with all the requests, and what you really need to do is flip to something which is a more decentralized model. So in this model, we've actually got 3 separate areas. So it might feel like these are different front doors into your intranet for different audiences. And your content publishers are therefore putting things through directly into the right place. So you've now in effect got a family of intranets rather than a single intranet, even though it might still be all running on the same physical system. And that doesn't take away maybe the ownership of the corporate homepage still being there. But what's happening is that your content editors, content owners might be pushing things through both onto the homepage as well as onto a more local site. And indeed, you might say, actually, we want to start aggregating some of this stuff bottom up from the other site. So the homepage becomes more pulling in from elsewhere rather than putting things onto the homepage and pushing it out into the further reaches. So what you're seeing now is that there's actually multiple people managing the sites. And with that comes the challenge of saying, well, how do we keep consistency when we've got more people to manage who also all have this publishing capability? Which is where governance comes in, doesn't it, Fleming?
Yeah, exactly. Because what we see is that when you start scaling beyond that single team or that single person, you need some different mechanism to actually control how do you govern all of your content. That's where governance models come in. I've just listed out sort of the 2 extremes of the spectrum. On the one side, you have the very loosely governed model where basically everybody can create any content anywhere. In this scenario, you have a little bit of a chaotic structure, so you typically rely on search technologies to surface the relevant documents. But you also need to be aware that the reader need to be a little bit critical to the author and the content, because as anybody can basically post out an article on any topic, then you need to be critical on that side. Whereas in the other extreme, you have the tightly governed scenario where all content is created according to strict governance lines. And those are typically permission enforced, so you're not allowed to publish something or change something where you don't have permissions for. And this scenario typically utilizes targeted navigation and a very thoughtful designed information architecture. And you'll also see that content is basically approved by its very location that it's placed in. Now, some examples for that on the sort of the loosely governed side of things, you can consider some of the vision that drives a lot of Microsoft's out-of-the-box scenarios right now. So they're bringing out a lot of stuff where you can basically, everybody can create an Office 365 group. You can put documents in it. Those documents can be about everything. And because you have this chaotic surface, then that matches nicely with the new SharePoint Home or Delve, where it basically looks into saying, so, well, these are the people that you trust, so I will surface their content for you. But you can't really navigate across that because it's a mess a little bit underneath. And in the other extreme, you have the tightly governed model where you have this really structured and targeted navigation. So for example, as an end user, I can navigate to the HR policies. And if I read something under the HR policies, I basically know that this is the official story for my organization because it's published under there. So I don't need to be that critical of the author itself. Now, in any given organization, you will typically have different types of content that will require different types of governance models on a high level. So a couple of examples is if you have a knowledge base somewhere, you can have knowledge articles in that, and that will typically be a little bit more loosely governed. Everybody can create that article, but you still need to be mindful of who's the author of that particular piece of knowledge. And on the other extreme, you have the more tightly governed, the policies and procedures. So again, if you go to the employee handbook, not everybody should be allowed to post that. It should be approved by the HR department, for example, to verify its veracity. Now, if you scale that even further across geography, you might run into scenarios where you need an additional dimension to this. So for example, if you consider the example where region A is in Europe, you can have the same approach that I just talked about. But if you then have a divisional portal in the US area of your organization, then the knowledge articles and the corporate news might follow the same governance that they do in Europe, but maybe the safety regulations doesn't need an even more tighter governance, because for legal ramifications, it's not enough that the safety office does a change. It might need to be approved by the legal department, for example. So basically, to achieve this sort of scaling mechanism of cross governance, you need to have this good content governance in place. And a couple of tips to achieve that from our perspective is to make sure you define on a high level the type of governance you have, and sort of make a mindful decision on the governance model for each of those. Make sure that you track ownership, contact and revision date for all of your content, and that's used to regularly follow up on the usage from the end users, and also on, does the content relevant, stay in touch, so this doesn't need to be updated. And finally, be mindful to add training and guidance and tools to content owners and editors. I'm sharing on the screen an example from one of our customers, which is a large engineering company, where on their administrators and editors support side, they can actually, they not only have access to the Wisdom content governance features, so they can see what content am I responsible for as an editor. Is there anything that's due for a revision that's under my responsibility? But they've also set up a lot of content to assist in training and guidance. So this goes a long way to actually ensure that governance model actually gets implemented from an organizational point of view as well.
So Fleming, I mean, I really like this example of having a site dedicated to administrators and editors. And looking back at the previous slide that you had, where you got maybe different approaches to different regions, is that something that Ramble have had to tackle when you go into this site? Would you see different policies according to the region that you're in?
But for their scenarios, they have the majority is to follow sort of alongside a lot of the same governance models across these dimensions. A lot of the key part of the organization is still focused around sort of the core organization. So they actually have this one side that then gets personalized to specific areas. So you can see specific parts that's related to other governance models. But we do see in other scenarios, if you have this very diverse editorial team, then it would make a lot of sense to actually set up separate governance sites to target that even further to that specific editor's team.
And in a way, it's kind of a small-scale reflection of what you have to do with things like HR policies, isn't it? Because what you don't want is to have separate HR policies for different countries, and normally that happens because each country has its own employment legislation that you have to follow. And then for something like Delve to show you 3 different HR policies for parental leave, and for someone to get the wrong terms and conditions because the search is going beyond the site that they should see.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and this, I think, is the challenge with the loosely governed approach that Office 365 defaults to, the kind of model that Microsoft is pushing out, in that you can create lots of separate HR sites. So you could have HR France and HR Spain and HR US, very easy to create. But something like a hub site to pull those together doesn't really make sense. What you really want to do is restrict access to those separate sites according to your different audiences, and be stricter with the governance, not just stitch them together again.
Yeah, I agree fully, because I think the Delve approach is good for the knowledge base. So if everybody in your organization is empowered and all the customers basically sharing good ideas and stuff, but if you can move on to the more sort of legal ramifications of some of your content, then that's not the right model for those types of content.
No. I've got to say, pragmatically, a lot of our clients, they go for the strictest governance and give everybody the same. So as a rule of thumb, if it works in German law, it's probably going to work everywhere, because Germany seems to be the strictest country going.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about different geographies for content, but of course what we also need to think about is different languages to fit with the geographies. So there was a ClearBox webinar a couple of months ago where we covered this, so I'm going to do it briefly here. If you want to see more, go to clearbox.co.uk and have a look at our recent webinar on multilingual intranet. But the basic scenario is, imagine we've got 3 employees in London, Paris and Rome, all dressed according to their national stereotypes. The simplest model is that the guy in London goes to the UK one, the guy in France goes to the French one, and they see only content in the local language. So that's fine if the way you operate is that each country can more or less be autonomous. But usually what happens with a larger organization is that you say, well, we don't feel like one company. We want a site on top which is truly global. So they'll stick an extra site in there, and usually it will be the corporate working language, and let's assume it's English, because a lot of large organizations, even if English isn't the first language, it's the common language for their employees. But that's fine as far as it goes. But you start to get a bit of a fight. So the people in France tend to still go to the French business one and ignore the global stuff. So they say, well, let's force people to go to the global site as a homepage, and everybody complains that they're missing all the local stuff. So really what you could do with is something which is a common entry point for everybody that picks up the user's preference and serves up the right language according to what their preferences are. And yes, of course, there'll be lots of implications for translation of content around that, which we dealt with in the other webinar. But you at least can get by with a system where you say, well, let's have the global stuff in multiple languages, but there'll be some things that only need to be in maybe the common language and the local language. So if you've got Italian employment policies, they probably only need to be in Italian and maybe the common language for the expats that you've got working there. To make all that operate then, what you've got to think about is a content management system where each page or each document, it understands that the variations on the document are translations. So it knows, for example, that this product brochure in English is the same as this French and Italian product brochure, and it will serve up the equivalent according to the right language preference. If you don't do that, what you risk is getting, for example, an up-to-date English policy, but a version in French, which is 2 iterations out of date, and that creates, for example, compliance risks and so on. Right, and then we're going to move on. Fleming.
That Sam, because I think this matches very much what we're seeing as well. One approach that we're seeing some organizations taking, because all of this approach makes sense, but it requires manual translation for everything. And one of the things that we're seeing is an additional dimension where some organizations saying for content that we don't have formal translation for, we will add in a capability to do on-demand translation, so the end user can basically go to the English side and then say, well, machine translate this page into Italian for me, with all those what quality that you might get from a machine translation. What are your thoughts on that approach as a supplement?
I think it's great if you can do it in a relatively seamless way, but you still need to flag that it's a machine translation. And most people are savvy enough about the web now. They've, for example, used Google Translate when they go to a foreign page and elected to see a machine translation, which is good enough to help with their comprehension. But in the enterprise, you just got to remember that there is a meaning to an official translation that you can't entirely bypass. So, for example, if you say, all of our employees have seen this policy, it has to be a signed off translation, and there's an actual process where you get certified translators to kind of stamp a translation as being a legal equivalent. You can't just say that the Google translation is good enough. But yeah, ultimately I think particularly Intranets as a communication vehicle, you can only communicate if people understand you, and doing it in a machine translation to help understanding is a very useful shortcut.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next topic is about depth, and we're going to talk about increasing the reach of your intranet to different kinds of workers. So a lot of the attention that we're seeing at ClearBox is around bringing frontline workers more on board with digital engagement. Particularly, I think what's driving it now is that loads of organizations that we talk to are saying, yeah, everybody is going to get an iPad, for example, or we're actually handing out more corporate-owned devices to workers who are in the field or customer-facing in a way that we never used to. So with that comes an opportunity to not only bring the intranet to the employee, but also do things like get direct feedback from customers. So if people are working in the storefront and they're doing a promotion or a sales promotion, then they can immediately get feedback coming back through to head office about the reaction to it. Or if you're in sales and doing a product demo, then you can get comments back from maybe a new product line or someone saying, you know, we tried that and we're having these 2 or 3 issues. and use things like an enterprise social network to start resolving it. The other big opportunity that we see is things like using the digital devices as a way to capture what's happening out on the front line. So that might be, for example, taking photographs of competitor installations, or Kobe, the Danish engineering company, they built an app where the architects can go out and take videos and photos as they inspect buildings and immediately share those back into a report template. And lastly, there's a great opportunity around saving costs. So it's not uncommon for office workers to have things like Workday for employee services, but to still use paper or more primitive approaches for frontline workers, because you couldn't assume that they would be able to do things like book holiday online. So if you give more devices, you can actually fully automate your processes. There's some issues to consider when you do this. Often the driver for giving everybody iPads isn't to give them the intranet. It's because there'll be something which is much more work specific. So it might be about engineering or inspections, or about retail or data gathering type application. So that's what's going to be open on the application most of the time. So you need to think through, well, where in the workflow process are we expecting them to access the intranet, and how easy is that going to be? And have we thought about just those basic niggles like single sign-on? One of our clients is a utilities company, and even though all their staff have mobile phones issued by the company, they still say, well, we are out on mountainsides, we can't necessarily even get a phone signal, let alone spend times waiting for intranet pages to download. So one of the considerations there is, how do you keep the page light enough that it would load very quickly on a slow connection? And lastly, as we design user interfaces for intranets, if we know they're going to be used by frontline workers a lot, you maybe need to do some very specific user testing and think about the design. So yeah, it could be that you need to have bigger buttons because people might be using them with gloves on, or it could be that environmentally they've got to have cases around the tablet, so it's waterproof, and therefore fine-grained selections of multiple items might be a lot harder if you've got an extra protective screen on top. And Fleming, you got a couple of interesting cases around this, I think.
Yeah, exactly, because I agree with that fully. And one of I think a truly interesting case is one of our customers is a multinational retail and distribution company. So a large part of their workforce consists of people that is minding the stores across the Nordics. And part of that job is basically they need to perform audit of the store facilities in adjacent areas. So that's basically making sure that the store appears up to code, and making sure you don't have inventory blocking fire doors and stuff like that. So they have policies and procedures to ensure that, and those are all stored on their intranet solution. Now they added a mobile app approach to this to reach those frontline workers. So, and that basically enabled the in-store staff to go out and perform, first off, see that policies directly from their mobile phone, so they can go out to the back alley, for example, to inspect that, look at what is it that I need to check up on, and actually use an online form on their phone as well to push in, attest that they have done the inspection, also put in any comments when necessary. And this was a huge benefit to that organization, because in the past they actually had to use these paper forms, as you also mentioned, Sam. Then they have to walk back and forth between the desktop PC to report part of it, and then go out again when they got a customer. Then they had to go back to the desktop PC and continue. So there's a much more uninterrupted flow in that scenario. So another case story for this scenario, let me just need to advance that, is another one of our customers is a Maritime piloted organization. So Maritime pilots is the people that actually sails out to a large ship and then take over the control from the captain and help steer that into particular difficult harbors. Now in this organization, they had a lot of details about all the harbors they service, stuff like water levels, which buoys to consider. They had online weather information on the internet. So they actually configured out specifically targeted mobile device ready pages on their internet, so that when a pilot was sort of preparing for that task, he or she could basically just take their mobile phone, and then they were just one tap away from getting those specific information that they needed to actually perform their job. So that brought in the internet much closer to their day-to-day work, whereas in the past they'd mainly been something that when they had downtime they could look at the news and maybe do a little bit of preparation, but the business information weren't that valuable because they didn't know where they were going to be tomorrow. So I think that's a good case for also for this scenario.
I think it's really nice if you can make an application like that part of the internet, because then all the messaging and the kind of bringing news within the application becomes a lot more feasible. But it's pretty rare. Often within any kind of line of business or work application, someone's built like a dedicated CRM or resource planning tool, which is far better than you could do within an intranet environment.
Yeah. So to add a little bit to the topic, we talked about the depth of bringing in frontline workers, but another big potential is adding in external users to your solution. And Office 365 basically provides a built-in infrastructure for doing this in external access. That basically means that it's easy, if you allow it, to add in people who are not part of your organization to parts of your solution. Now, there's a bunch of opportunities for this. For collaboration purposes, it makes a lot of sense that you can collaborate directly with external stakeholders. You don't have to go to sort of jump through hoops to get information to external parties. But you can also take an entire digital process that spans outside your organization. So if you imagine a form somewhere on the internet where one of your business partners can actually submit information into it and it goes into an internal workflow as part of your solution. There's also some issues to consider, of course. The key one being the permission setting becomes even more important. And the reason for this is obviously because if you mismanage your permission and get somebody inside your organization get access to information they shouldn't have, the result is not that big of a deal in 99% of the scenarios, because they're your own employees, so they have a loyalty and they're also contractually bound to how should they actually contain such information. But if you give access to an external user and they suddenly get access to stuff that they shouldn't have, they're not bound by those loyalty mechanisms or those legal mechanisms. So you need to be more mindful of the permission settings.
I think I read recently, Fleming, that the default for everyone in SharePoint had changed. So it used to be that everyone might include external users, but now it explicitly doesn't by default.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's built into to make sure that you don't by accident set a too wide permission for it. You have to explicitly set that now. It's exactly right, Sam.
Yeah.
So to give you a real life case for that as well, one of our customers is an engineering company and they're fairly large, and obviously a lot of their work consists on project works. They will do thousands of projects that is high collaboration intensive and with a lot of external parties as well, external stakeholders, subcontractors and stuff like that. So for them, bringing in those external users directly into the project sites meant that they could collaborate on equal terms on documents, on templates, and they could even share the same guidance on how do we actually deliver this joint project to our customers. Tying back to the missions, in order to succeed with this, they configured a very clearly defined roles, including some inherent permission settings for that project. So basically, when you start up a project, you define who's the project manager, who's the project team, and then you have a separate role for these are external team members, and these are external stakeholders. And then the permission setting would all automatically set, so the project team could see everything like the KPIs, but the external team could only see the deliverable documents and the draft documents, and the external stakeholders might only see the deliverables. So they're tying into that role, they actually had this specific permission setting.
I guess that there is a level of quite strict governance you need then to make that operate. My own experience is that users worry that a file might end up in the wrong place and become visible to the wrong people. There's a kind of comfort in having maybe separate sites for internal and external and keeping permissions split at that level.
Yeah, and it's a discussion that you need to be very mindful of, because obviously if you do this separate site for that time, then you lose a little bit of that sort of seamless collaboration, because then you have to push that draft document over to the external facing side and so forth. But there are some mechanisms for doing that. Again, I would, for collaboration purposes, it makes a lot of sense if you can add them into this, but you need to be mindful of where do you store which type of information? You need to be very mindful that I store this document on the deliveries if it's not supposed to be seen by somebody else, for example.
Yeah, yeah. There is a way in Office 365 where you can say, what is it that Fleming can see in this site, isn't there? Or why is it that Sam has permission to see this particular file? It will kind of, if you click on the advanced permissions setting, it will say, these are the groups that Sam's a member of, and that's why he can see this particular file, just to help you almost do like a cross-check on that. We've got a couple of questions about licensing, which I think maybe it would be time to take. So Mahmoud Salim asked, is anonymous access allowed in Office 365 so you could create a public site using SharePoint Online and give access to public people? Fleming, you maybe know more about this, but it used to be, and then they discouraged it, didn't they?
Yeah. It used to be, and they discontinued it, I think, 2 years ago. I think actually, if you have a tenant from back then, you still have that option. I think we have a very long phase-out period, but you can't do it for new Office 365 tenants. They discontinued anonymous access entirely. Yeah.
And someone called Quoc H, I hope I got that right. How does licensing work concerning external collaboration if a partner has an Office 365 license or not? So I think it's really generous, but the person you're sharing with doesn't need an Office 365 license if they are outside of your domain. So if I have a client site and not an Office 365 yet, I can invite john@customerco.org into my team site, for example, and he'll be able to see everything and interact with it without having a separate license allocated to him. But of course, you're still going to need things like a PowerPoint license and a Word license if he wants to manipulate the content without just using the web office interface. Fleming, is there anything to add to that?
No, I agree, and I also agree with the sentiment. I think it's very generous. So it's a huge opportunity for organizations on Office 365. The only thing we've gotten a couple of questions saying, so when is somebody an external user? And it's very important. The license term says that if they're contractually part of your organization, then they cannot be an external user. So if it's somebody on your payroll, then you have to do a formal license for them. They're not an external user. So you can't have some scenarios, people saying, well, could I maybe just bring in some of our frontline workers and having them use their Hotmail account for it? And that's not allowed. But otherwise, I think it's spot on, Sam.
Yeah. So if they have their own Office 365 license, it doesn't actually make that much difference. The only exception at the moment is if you are using the Teams, so Microsoft's rival to Slack, if you're using Teams, you can only extend guest access to people who also have an Office 365 license at the moment. That is meant to change.
Yeah.
Okay, now we move on to talk about extending the features within your Office 365 intranet. And one of the things that we wanted to get across is the advantage of extending things incrementally, so using an Agile versus Waterfall approach. If you're a developer, you probably know this inside out, but if you don't, let me just briefly explain it. So the idea of a Waterfall approach is that you'll probably spend quite a lot of time in the first phase defining requirements, and then you might spend maybe up to 9 months, even longer, developing a solution. So building an intranet, building out all the functionality needed to match those requirements. And what happens is that the gap between going to your employees and going to your stakeholders and saying, what do you want? And switching on a new intranet that's populated and ready to go as a response to those requests is very often 15 months, 18 months or more. And that can be really frustrating for the organization. It's also quite risky because in those intervening 18 months, maybe the requirements have changed as internal and external reorganizations might have happened, for example. So if you can, what we advocate instead is taking this Agile approach. And the idea of Agile is that you launch things much earlier, but without all the functionality that people have asked for. So you might have heard MVP, minimal viable product, as the popular terminology behind this. So you come up with something which is just a new platform and maybe just the core content. And then you work on a series of waves or agile sprints, which could last, typically we recommend about 3 months. And in each wave, what you do is pilot some new functionality, so create something almost like at beta level, learn about it, get some feedback, and then in the next wave, refine it. And this is what you see, for example, with Facebook and Google, where nobody even knows what version of Google Office they're on. It's probably like 18.3.2, and every few weeks some new functionality is released. As you're building out that new functionality, you can start piloting new functionality for the next wave. So you're both growing the proven stuff and beta testing the next change in functionality. So the big advantage of this is that instead of waiting 18 months before you see value from this new intranet platform, this new intranet approach, you can maybe get there within 6 months. And also you're gathering detailed requirements within the wave. So the requirements that you gather are current and you respond to it within the next wave. So within 3 months rather than 18 months, you can start to show some changes. A great example of this is Swisscom, and I'm grateful to Thomas Mader who let me share this slide. I think Thomas is listening in as well, so I'm waving at you, Tom, if you're there. Swisscom is one of these really mature intranets, and when you look at it and you think, gosh, you know, it fits together really well. What did they do? The answer is that they've been doing it right for an awfully long time, and their model is that every 2 years they might do a major release. So you can see these like the major version numbers where they focused on collaboration and the employee portal, but they also accrue to do 4 minor releases per year. So they're doing those 3-month waves, and every 3 months they're introducing new features and new functionality and iteratively refining things. And that's so important, I think, for having an intranet that feels alive and feels like it's constantly evolving. And that fits pretty well, I think, with the in-a-box approach that Wisdom takes, doesn't it, Fleming?
Yeah, it does, and I really like the case story from Swisscom, and I think I've been a huge Agile fan for many years, and I think in our mind the Agile approach is perfect with in-a-box products, and the reason for that is, as explained, I'll go a little bit back in time because I've been doing SharePoint custom projects way before there was something like called in-a-box products, and in the past you might have an intention to do Agile, but typically you were bound to at least a fairly close to the waterfall model because you had to custom build a lot. So you had to do sort of a clearly defined scope of your entire future solution because you needed to get cost estimates from a vendor or your internal IT department to get your budget constrained. And in many cases, you knew that you will get this budget and then you won't get any more money for the next 5 years. So you actually had to do a whole upfront scoping of the entire solution. And what I really love with the Agile approach and why I feel that it matches very much with the in-a-box product line is that here you can actually have this big vision, but you can deliver the value in increments. Because if you pick the platform or the product that matches your long-term vision, also the stuff that you won't do in phase 1, but you might want to do in 3 years' time, then you actually have that future-proof and you have those features ready. And then you can start continuously utilizing more and more capabilities in the platform when you do a test like you explained, Sam, also when the organization matures and new requirements arise. So you don't need to go out and request more funding to do custom build stuff. So it lends itself very nicely into this Agile approach, at least in my mind. Now, there's one thing to note in order to actually succeed with all of this approach about having this big vision, but delivering sort of continuously, and that is you need to make sure that you set an organization to support this continuous evolution. Because if you do your rollout like a project, and then when you reach the first phase, go live, and then your entire internal project team goes away to different tasks, then you don't really have anyone to follow up on that. And that's one thing that I find really interesting around the Swisscom example is how did they actually set the organization to make sure that they could drive that forward continuously in their organization. So just to add a little bit on that, I can mention one of our another customer from the Wisdom side is an engineering company where they actually did this whole sort of digital workplace strategy, selected product and platform. And then they had a bunch of different initiatives. So they actually started off delivering a project portal, delivering that in Agile sprints, according to a model similar to the one that you showed, Sam. So doing it in iterations. And they started with the project portal because they had a time constraint on when that should be released in the first phase. But then actually in parallel, they were able to do an additional parallel stream of delivering an intranet even before the project portal was finished. So they could actually do multiple parallel streams for the different deliveries on the platform, because there were different stakeholders. They had a coordinating steering group, and because they didn't need to they needed to have a long-term vision for each stream, but they didn't need to know all the details. So it made it more easy for both the project teams and the organization to cope with these amount of changes, pushing those out. So that's another benefit that we see from the Agile approach.
It's so tempting, isn't it, when organizations get Office 365 to switch everything on at the start, and I do think is a mistake, because it's not just about having the features, it's actually about taking the time to introduce it to employees and say, we understand what the problem is that you're trying to address, and here's how Office 365 is part of the solution. Otherwise, I see all employees, they just get a bit overwhelmed by saying, IT just switched all this stuff on and we don't know what it's for, but somehow they feel the pressure to use it.
I fully agree. Actually, I had a customer where they operated with, they had an internal term which they call change coins. So they operated, we have these amount of change coins every year that we can push out to our organization. They did a project and say, well, this will actually cost us 500 change coins, so we only have 200 change coins left, then we can't do a whole new external rollout, for example. I think there's a brilliant analogy to sort of be mindful of how much change can you push out to the organization, even if the technology is not the barrier.
Yeah, very good. Okay, and then we just got a one last slide on the Office 365 dimension, haven't we?
Yeah. So with regards to the topic of scaling Office 365 intranets, there's a couple of things to know on sort of the platform level. The first thing that I want to mention is that SharePoint Online is a fully scaled and fully featured SharePoint that's managed and secured by Microsoft. The reason I'm bringing this up is because in the past we often heard the comparison saying, so but SharePoint Online, that's a dumbed down or featureless version of the SharePoint on-premise. And that might have been the case going 2 or 3 years back, but it's not the case anymore. So you need to know that you actually have sort of the largest engine with all the bells and whistles on, if you choose to switch it on. You also need to be mindful that Office 365 services are continuously updated. So Microsoft will continually push out changes. This is particularly important if you choose to custom build stuff on your own Office 365 internet. You need to make sure that you will need to be aware of those changes and change your custom builds accordingly, or obviously go with a vendor like us and we'll do it for the customer. But that's something that you need to pay attention to. And then there's a point about, you need to know that your SharePoint Online tenant is on a shared SharePoint infrastructure. And so some scenarios that might mean that we have, you can have some rare peak hours. So you have many thousand users at one given minute, then you might get sort of every 20 click might be slower than all of the rest because you're on a large infrastructure that's shared with other people. But on the plus side, you also need to know that SharePoint Online basically scales itself. So if you merge with another organization and go from 1,000 users to 5,000 users, you don't need to do anything because the platform will scale itself. So the last thing I mentioned, I'll keep this brief, but one thing to note is that right now, SharePoint and SharePoint Online, the architecture behind it means that if you're a European-based organization, your content is stored in a European data center. That basically means if you have a US user sitting in Denmark, for example, they will have to, when they request a page from the internet, they will have to do the networking traffic to Europe. And that can mean a second or two in delay compared to that. Microsoft is actually moving out what they call multi-geo distribution, where you can set pieces of your solution. Some sites will be hosted in the US data center. To make this, if you have an organization with multiple geographies, then you get better response times, and you also get some better regulatory possibilities in your solution. This is announced. It's not released yet. They're going into selective preview, which basically means beta 2018, and launching sometime in the future.
Does that basically mean that if you have, say, a European HQ but a Singapore office, then the data in the Singapore team sites could be based in Asia instead?
Yeah, exactly. It goes with, well, the details is a little bit unknown, but it looks like it will go into site collection. So you'll need to be mindful about, you might want to have the Singapore divisional portal should be in a separate site collection. Then you can say this site collection will be located in the Asia Pacific data center instead.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right, so thank you for that. We're on to the Q&A section. So if you've got any burning questions, we are open for them. I can see that there's a few coming already. So we'll just give you a minute or two to think of any questions. Please do type those into the questions box. While you're having a think, a couple of offers from ourselves and Wisdom. So from ClearBox, we do this annual report called SharePoint Intranets in a Box. So if you've got SharePoint or Office 365 and you want to build an intranet on top quickly and extend that kind of functionality from the basic stuff that you get from Microsoft, then there are many products out there, of which Wisdom is one of the ones that we gave recognition to as being a very strong player in this space. But because we don't sell any of the products ourselves, we are able to do an independent evaluation based on the kind of scenarios that intranet owners, internal communications people would come to these products looking for. So that's on sale now. It's the 2018 edition. It got 430 pages. It's very substantial, very comprehensive. And we're willing to give you 10% off with the code Wisdom Webinar. So when you go to checkout, just put Wisdom Webinar in there for your 10% off. And Fleming?
Yeah, and I can, for my sake, my point as well, even though we're biased because we're part of the report, but I can recommend that report as well, Sam. I think your team did an excellent job on this. It's very comprehensive on all of the different players that you describe in it. So from our side, what we do is if you find something in this webinar that is of particular interest to you, we'll offer you a free follow-up call where you can talk about some of these real-life customer cases. If you have burning questions on how did that particular case that you talked about, how did they manage that scenario? We're sitting in this sort of situation. How would you approach that with your solution? So that's an offer from ours as well. So there's contact information at the end of the deck, so you can reach out to us, and we will gladly do a follow-up vision call with you.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's start with a question from Scott Bennison. Scott says, what can be done if we're in phase one but dislike the design and functionality? So I'm guessing this is going back to the kind of the Agile model. But it might even be like this. So if you're starting out where you're feeling like the platform isn't right, I guess from my point of view, the best thing to do is restart it. So if you're clear on the requirements and you don't feel that you're beginning with a platform that's going to let you grow with it and scale, any further development on it or even adding content is only going to lock you more into something which isn't going to work for you in the long term. Is that something you've ever come across, Fleming?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say that when we typically draw Agile, we typically draw it in a forward-moving stream. But to be truly Agile, if you come across that scenario which Scott mentioned, then it's basically vital to say, well, then we actually have to go back one iteration and just look and see, so what are the challenges with it? How can we change it? And it might feel like a setback because then you're moving one step back. You actually have to redo a phase. But consider you actually get this feedback after 1 month instead of getting after the 18 months where everything is sort of dependent on it and you might not be able to change it anymore.
Yeah, it's maybe worth saying as well that if you started out with an in-a-box product that isn't working out for you, and not every product is the right match for every company, that's why we emphasize being clear about your requirements up front, then some of the products, not all, but some of the products will let you basically end the licensing but keep all your data. So if you want that kind of safety net, look for a product where your data stays within SharePoint and you don't, for example, create new stories which are hosted outside of SharePoint. And it just makes it that much easier to untangle from the vendor if for whatever reason it turns out not to be the right match.
And I obviously fully agree with that.
Yes. Then we have a question from Miguel. Which strategy have you found useful to promote digital dexterity so that value can be really capitalized out of an Office 365 scaling process? Okay. I think yeah, go on.
Yeah, I can take one stab at this. It's a small question, but it seems huge.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that there are a couple of dimensions to that. I think one important thing is to make sure that if you want to really capitalize on all of the Office 365 scalability, you need to invest in knowing what the Office 365 platform is, what it can do, and what it cannot do. So you need to set some sort of a major part of this is set some sort of organization to keep track on what Microsoft is changing and reflect on how will that interfere in our organization. Obviously, as a vendor, that's what we do because we're dependent on building on top of that. But I think it's a very good approach for organizations as well to how can we best utilize all of this stuff, because Microsoft will basically just push out great features, but not necessarily tell you this feature is good for this scenario and this feature is good for that scenario. So I think one part of that is basically to make sure that you invest in continuous research and looking into what are the changes and how will that actually be utilized for us. So organization is a big part of it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I said earlier that you shouldn't feel obliged to launch everything out of Office 365 all in one go. And I think I'd even go further and say you don't have to launch some parts of Office 365 ever if it's not right for your organization. But what you might consider is that you could launch parts of Office 365 only to a particular division or only to a particular demographic. So you could see, for example, the research and development team might get a lot more benefit from something like the Teams tool, whereas the rest of the organization could be better off just sticking with something like Yammer, where it's a looser, less intensive form of sharing knowledge and collaboration. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the wave model that we were showing on the Agile slide, if I just hop back to that one, I think one of the great things about doing the pilots up front is that you could say, let's test Teams with the research and development group and get some data on how it works. And if we find it's a massive success, we can take those success stories and say who else in our organization is in a similar situation and share with them how research and development have benefited. And I really find that in terms of building adoption, you can't beat a homegrown success story rather than a success story from another industry or another organization. There's something about talking about your own people in your own language that really gets people going, hey, yeah, I'll try that too.
Yeah, I agree. And again, so I think the important thing, it's easy to get tied up in the bits and pieces and all the features, but make sure, and that's what you're saying as well, make sure that you be mindful of what is that we want to achieve in this scenario, and then choose the right service for what you want to achieve.
Yeah. Another question we had was any comments on best practice when moving from SharePoint on-premises to Office 365? What's worth keeping in mind?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things to consider in this scenario. Obviously, the technology is the same. You need to, obviously, if you have an existing on-premise and you want to move it to SharePoint Online, those are two different SharePoint installations. So you need to migrate your content or start recreating it depending on how bad a state you're in. Are you only updating for a technology reason, or is there other reasons as well? I think another part of the best practice is to make sure that typically what we see, a lot of existing SharePoint on-premises have a lot of custom-built functionality on it. And again, I would say you can, of course, custom build that again on Office 365, but what we're seeing, maybe for obvious reasons, is that many of our customers come to us because they have a very ambitious existing, maybe SharePoint 2010 or SharePoint 2013 platform, and they can't really upgrade it anymore, and they already have Office 365 licenses. So they're saying, so how can we actually easiest move to a new platform of Office 365 and do away with all of these customizations? And a lot of that process basically goes into, well, we have this feature here that we custom built that matches with this in-a-box products out-of-the-box feature. We have this one that matches to that piece of that bit itself. So I think that's a thing to consider. So consider you need to migrate your content, and consider if you have done custom build development, you can redo it on Office 365, but obviously consider if you want to keep maintaining that software or you want to go with one of the out-of-the-box vendors.
Yeah, very good. Okay, we're nearly on the hour, Fleming, so I think we should draw things to a close. So our last slide is just the the contact details. So if you want to follow up on anything that's piqued your interest from either ClearBox or Wisdom, both sides, I'm sure, will be very, very happy to hear from you. As promised, we'll share the slides through SlideShare. We've also been recording this, so if one of your colleagues missed it, you can tell them how unlucky they were, but then deliver the good news that we'll share the link for you to send them to the video recording as well. So thank you everyone for joining into this webinar, and thank you to Fleming as well. It's great to talk to you. Cheers.